So a question came up about how to pause an FSM in Unity and Playmaker. And I've created a small demo scene here that does 3 different ways of pausing with different effects. So here, if we press the red button, the red cube will stop its motion. When I press it again, it will restart in the center position and move to the left. It'll just restart its FSM as if the game had started over again. The blue cube, if I press that button, will pause, and if I press it again, it restarts exactly where it was before. If I press the white button, which just pauses time, both cubes will pause, and in fact, everything in the scene will pause. And I press it again, time restarts, and they can both continue doing what they're doing. So what I want to show is 3 different ways to do this, and you can pick and choose whatever way works best for your game. So let's take a look at the red cube and see what's going on here. So we click on the red cube and look at its FSM. We've got a start and restart transitions here that go to this reset action. And this reset action, all it's doing is setting the position of the transform. So I did that by taking the red cube, dragging and dropping it here, going to transform, set property, choosing the local position, vector 3, and simply typing in a value. So not the most clever way of setting a position, but for the purpose of this tutorial, that'll work just fine. After it resets that position, it goes to the left, and this is a simple move towards action. And again, I typed in the value of where I wanted it to go. When it's done with that, it transitions to the right. Same kind of idea. I typed in the value of where I wanted it to go. When it's finished, it goes back to the left and cycles back and forth between these left and right states. The pause action here comes from this global transition pause that goes to the state that has nothing in it. And the pause effect comes from the fact that we are not running any code. We break out of this loop and we're in this state here. You can see that if I push play here, this is alternating between the left and right. And as soon as I push the button, we're stuck here in this do nothing state. And that's why we get the effect of pausing. When I unpause, we come back to this reset and start over again. So the important piece here in this model are the global transitions. I've created a pause and a restart, and then I've checked this box here to make them global transitions. And again, global transitions can be called by another FSM, which is the important action that's going on here that allows us to pause. So let's take a look at the red button and see what it's doing. We've got a start, and then we go immediately to this wait for click to pause. And so this is using the on-click event. This is again downloaded through the ecosystem browser. This has not come by default with Playmaker, which moves us onto this pause state. Now, this pause state, what it does is use the send event, and I am calling on a very specific object, a specific FSM, and I'm calling this pause send event. So what that's doing is calling this global transition here and going to the do nothing state. After it does that, we move on to this other state, which is waiting for another click. If it gets that click, it moves to this reset, which does the send event action again, but this time it calls the restart event, which restarts the FSM. So that's one way to do it. Let's take a look at the blue cube. It's a little bit different, a little bit more complicated. The blue cube here, if we're looking at the FSM on the cube itself, this FSM is virtually identical to the red cube. I've reformatted it a little bit, but what I've added are these left and right global transitions. So if I look at my events, you can see I still have my pause and my restart, but I also have my left and my right global transitions. So again, these are very important. This will allow us to restart the FSM, not back here at the very beginning, but let us to basically jump into the FSM on the left state or the right state, depending on where we were when we hit the pause button. So that's pretty simple. We didn't add too much to that. What is more complicated is the blue button FSM. So if we look over here, this is considerably more complicated than the red cube button. The first state here is again the on click event, just waiting for a click. And then we go to the pause state. So this looks similar on the outside, but we have a new action here. And this action that we're calling here is the get FSM state. So we need to know what state the blue cube was in. Was it going to the left or was it going to the right before we pause it? So we get that and then we store it as a string variable. So this is just a string variable. Look over here. Here's my blue state. It is just a string variable. So we're storing the state. And then after we stored the state, we said, okay, you're moving to the left. Then we call the event of pause, just like we did before. We hit the pause button. After we call the pause, the blue cube stops moving because it's in that do nothing state. The blue button moves on to this wait for a click to restart, just like the red button did. So we're again waiting for a click. And here's where it gets a little bit more complicated. After it does that, we move to this state, which I didn't name. We'll just call this switch state. And what this is doing, this is using an action called a string switch. And this is a switch command if you're familiar with other coding. And so what we're doing is we're comparing that blue state that we saved earlier. We went and grabbed that. And we're going to compare it to these other strings. Is that state left or is that state right? And it's important, this is case sensitive. So I believe if I had a lowercase l there, this event would never get called. So you got to be a little careful there. And then from there, it's reasonably straightforward. We call this transition or this event restart left or restart right, depending on what's happening. You'll also notice that there's a third transition here on the switch state, and that's finished. So if for some reason neither of these were true, it will just reset the blue cube. That's what's going on there. So if for some reason we weren't in left or right, we're going to reset it. And I did that as much for debugging purposes in case I spelled these wrong or who knows, something else is happening. I wanted a way to reset the cube. So let's look at this restart left. Let's imagine that we went to the left. We call this transition restart left. What happens in here? All we're doing is calling the send event again, but this time we're calling the send event, or we're calling the global transition left instead of restart or right. If we look at the restart right, we're calling the right global transition. If we look at the reset, we're calling the restart global transition. So basically the difference is we now have, when we unpause the blue cube, we have three different states that we could call. We could restart it, we could continue going to the left, or continue going to the right. So if you're building a game where you need to pause an object and restart it in the exact same state, this could be quite complicated. You may end up with 5, 6, 10 different states that you have to go to, but the principle is the same. You use a switch statement, and then you have an action or a state for each of those states. So I hope that makes sense. It is definitely a little bit more complicated, and I'll make sure that this scene gets linked in the video. So let's take a look at the last option here, which is this pause button. And this pause button is all based on the FSM of the pause button. There's nothing else it's interacting with, so which is nice and pretty straightforward. On the outside here, this pause button looks pretty similar to the red and blue buttons. We've got a state here where we're waiting for a click. Again, using this on click event that we downloaded through the ecosystem browser. We get a click, we call this clicked event. We go over here to pause time. And this is where it's a little bit different. So we're using this action scale time, and we just set it to 0. So effectively what that means is that the frame rate, if you will, goes to 0. Now that doesn't mean that the game's going to lock up, but it's not calling updates anymore. The game's not ticking through anything anymore. The UI is still able to get commands. That's why we can unpause the game, but we're just scaling the time to 0. After it's done that, we move to this other state, which again is waiting for an on-click event. So if we click it again, it goes to this state, which is a restart time, and we reset the scale time to 1, 1 being the normal time scale. You can, of course, go up and make the game go faster if you wanted to. or you could slow down time. You can do lots of different things. So that's how the pause time works. Pretty straightforward there. So I hope that was helpful. If you have some more questions, please feel free to leave them as comments. Thanks for joining. I'll see you next time.